This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern. Every week we bring you conversations with authors about their books and research and other things that we like. And if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon, click and support us. Some of you have been doing this for months and years, and we cannot thank you enough. This is the second episode in a series co-sponsored by the Sadie and Ludwig Kahn Chair in Jewish History at UCLA. And I'm delighted to be joined by Professor David N. Myers, who holds the Kahn Chair. Professor Myers is Distinguished Professor of Jewish History, as well as the Director of the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. David, welcome back to the co-host seat.
Great to be with you again.
Our guest today is a political philosopher and prominent public intellectual. He is the president of the Jerusalem-based Herzl Institute and the chairman of the DC-based Edmund Burke Foundation. His 2018 book, The Virtue of Nationalism, was an international bestseller, and his most recent book, Conservatism, A Rediscovery, was published earlier this year by Regnery. Yoram Chazoni, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you, Gilad. Good to see you and good to see David again.
So the rediscovery of conservatism stands for a call to save it from its association with liberalism, which has become the norm in the Western world since the latter half of the 20th century and has corrupted conservatism, according to your argument. In what ways do conservatism and liberalism clash, and what elements of conservatism are overshadowed by liberalism and need to be rediscovered?
Well, you know, this book was written after 2020, and so it's written in the shadow of the collapse of hegemonic liberalism in many, possibly most of the institutions, formerly liberal institutions in the United States, the UK, and in many other countries across Europe. So the principal question that I set out to answer in this book is one that I get from every time I speak in front of audiences, especially young audiences. There's always young people who immediately ask, why do we need to talk about conservatism? Conservatism hasn't conserved anything in generations. And it's just been a kind of ongoing cultural revolution since the 1960s, culminating in woke neo-Marxism. And so the purpose of the book is to try to understand why what has been called conservatism in the post-war era, why it failed to prevent the rise of woke neo-Marxism. And the basic answer, I'm certainly not alone in this, is that it's not actually conservatism, that the dominant ideas, even in what are called conservative parties in the US or the UK or in Germany, those are basically liberal parties. And so there's a need to rediscover what historic conservatism was if we're interested in being able to stabilize the societies that we live in and move into a kind of framework that allows us to transmit something from one generation to the next, which is precisely what we're not able to do right now.
So I'm going to follow up and ask, what stands at the heart of your vision of conservatism? It seems that what you find objectionable in liberalism, which is, to me, as I understand and read you, a kind of synonym for woke neo-Marxism, which two political ideologies that I would not associate with one another, but we can talk about that. But
they're not even slightly synonyms. They're antonyms. They're completely different ideologies, which is why it's worth reading the book.
Let me go to liberalism, because you are critical of liberalism, and then you also are critical of woke neo-Marxism. Part of what seems to be objectionable to you, if we go back to your reading from the Enlightenment and your heroes Selden and Burke, is, if I understand correctly, that liberalism erases difference. And difference is key to giving texture to nations, tribes, congregations, to your understanding of tradition. And it's a totally understandable sentiment. And one of the people whom I've studied, Shimon Ravidovich, spoke of the libertas differendi, the right to be different. So I have a great deal of appreciation for that. But the alternative to sort of liberal equality, this principle of difference, can lead to negative and even terrifying outcomes, right? Like racial hierarchies that regard Jews as subhuman. And so what safeguards does your version of liberalism have to prevent this kind of excess in the sort of enshrining the doctrine of difference as a core principle?
Well, look, that's a number of questions. They're all good questions, but let's try to take them a step at a time. Let's start with how I'm using the word liberalism. So the set of ideas that the assumptions that I'm calling Enlightenment liberalism, and I'm asserting that these have been dominant in the democratic world for the last 60 years at least. They begin with the assertion that human beings are by nature perfectly free and perfectly equal, and then goes on to assert that obligations, moral or political obligations, are principally undertaken by consent rather than being inherited. That is that you need to agree one way or another in order to take on moral or political obligations. And from there, the claim is made that the only legitimate purposes of the state are to defend the liberties and equalities that belong to each of us by nature. So that set of assumptions I call liberalism. There are obviously many different kinds of liberals. There are progressive liberals and libertarians and classical liberals. And you're right, David, in observing that because Enlightenment liberalism is a species of Enlightenment rationalism, and it does claim to describe absolute political truths in all times and places and in every culture and every civilization. And in that sense, you're right that it does have a homogenizing effect, because every place that people take this as the basic framework begins to look like every other place. But that I wouldn't say that that's my primary objection to it. My primary objection to it is that first of all, that none of these claims are empirically true. That is, it's a false set of assumptions. All three of these assumptions are simply not. There's no way to actually defend them empirically, and so the only defense for them is a utilitarian defense. That if it's the case that believing these things, kind of like a noble myth or noble lie, leads to the best possible life, then I think a lot of people would be happy to just keep teaching them. The problem with it, from an empirical perspective, is that it doesn't seem to have the ability to propagate itself from one generation to the next. So it's now, as I said, 60 years, 70 years since the victory of Enlightenment liberalism in the West, and it has collapsed. And there's still plenty of liberals running around, but the moment that you can be fired for being a liberal from the New York Times or from Princeton University, that's the moment that you realize that somebody else is in charge. That's these woke neo-Marxists that we're talking about. And the question in front of us is what can replace liberalism, not because we don't like it, but because it is not strong enough to hold off the collapse of the structure of ideas that we've been living in during our lives. That's the crisis in front of us. So, whether you like liberalism or not is not exactly the problem. The problem is what is a strong enough force to stand up against this neo-Marxism, and what kind of a political outlook would allow you to build something that would withstand more than 2 generations before it runs out of steam and collapses.
Why do you think that woke neo-Marxism prevails in a way that, a more classical version of Marxism failed in face of liberalism? Or in other words, what did liberalism do well vis-a-vis Marxism that it cannot do vis-a-vis woke neo-Marxism?
I'm not completely sure that I'm certainly not an expert in the history of Marxism, but the simplified version that I heard from my professors was that the original Marxism, which is a theory of competition of groups based on economics, that theory was had to be revised in the wake of World War I because the prediction that proletariat, the working class groups throughout Europe would unite against their nations turned out to be false. So if that's, it may be that one of you knows the story better than I do, but my understanding is that the Frankfurt School and Gramsci and others after World War I expanded the kinds of groups that Marxist theory is willing to think about. And as soon as you're not talking about economic classes, but you allow other kinds of cohesive groups that are capable of internal loyalty and struggling as a group, as soon as you do that, then you have a more realistic form of Marxism. It recognizes better what, not just what groups should human beings be loyal to, but what kinds of groups are they loyal to? And so as soon as you start looking at ethnic groups and cultural groups and other kinds of groups, sometimes they can be economic, but not always, and start asking who is oppressing whom, you have a much better theory. That theory has proved to be very attractive to academics, but also to countless students, both in America and Europe. And one of the questions that I try to deal with in my book is to understand why a student who doesn't have any particular background in any of this goes to university ends up being much more attracted to neo-Marxism than to liberalism. And since the liberal assumption had been that if you just allow people to study liberalism, they'll come to think that it's basically self-evident and everybody will agree to it. But we know that's not true. So chapter 7 of my new book is in part about the strengths of Marxism in its critique of liberalism, the fact that it's willing to consider the oppression of or exploitation of one group in society by another is, I think that's the thing that so many students find attractive, is that they think that a liberal view, which doesn't actually recognize group oppression or group exploitation, a liberal view they think is naive. And as soon as you start looking at who's in charge of a given society, what groups are in charge, and how do they teach a ruling ideology to all the other groups in order to maintain control, there's a lot of truth in that. I'm not saying that that I buy all of it, and I'm not saying that I buy their solutions, but as an analysis, I think that that's very powerful, and it's proved to be something that a great many young people find much more persuasive than the claims of liberals who say, well, look, our legal framework does recognize individual liberties and equalities, and as a consequence, we don't have to do anything else because our society is already just. And young people say, well, look, in many ways, it's not just. And they come to see Marxism as being much more powerful and attractive.
But why do you think it took so long? Why did it take 70 years? How did liberalism fend off this neo-Marxism successfully, more or less, for a long time? And why is 2020 or the current era that we're in is a watershed?
I don't think it was so successful. I mean, look, I'm speaking with hindsight, so I want to sort of emphasize that I'm not claiming that at every stage in the last 60 or 70 years that I would have understood what was happening. But if we look at the history of post-war liberalism, I think it's not unreasonable to plot it as a trajectory that begins by removing God and Scripture and traditional religion from a central place in the public sphere, directly attacks race, especially in the context of American abuse and persecution of blacks in the South and elsewhere, that doesn't lead to any kind of stable arrangement. So subsequent to that, it turns out that you can discriminate not just on the basis of race or on the basis of religion, and that those things need to be eliminated, but also that there's discrimination on the basis of sex, there's discrimination on the basis of national origin. Those are both directly written into civil rights law in the United States and elsewhere in the 1960s. And from there, it goes on to try to eliminate discrimination on the basis of age, on the basis of physical abilities, discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. And every time that a step of this kind is taken, what is required is the deconstruction of traditional ways of doing things. And I'm not familiar with anybody who knows where it's supposed to end. At this point, we're at the stage where it's the distinction between male and female that is being deconstructed, and there are quite a lot of liberals, both intellectuals and sort of in the general public, who try to retain the old 1960s kind of liberalism, and they can't understand how that arrived at the claim that that a man can decide that he's a woman, or that a woman can decide that she's a man. And so my argument is it's not terribly complicated, but I think that what we're looking at is a rolling cultural revolution in which liberalism progressively adopts, one step at a time, the accusations that it hasn't brought about true liberty and true equality. I'm not saying that liberals always agree with Marxists. That's not true at all. But every time a decade goes by, roughly, that you can see that there's something else in the accusations of the Marxists, who often correctly are saying, look, this just isn't equality. It's just not individual freedoms like the liberals promised. There's always some truth to the claims that they're making. And the liberals end up adopting some part of it on an ongoing basis. And, we thought that ought to be able to reach some kind of terminus. But it turns out that the terminus is when the woke neo-Marxists get strong enough so that they just say, okay, look, the liberals aren't in charge anymore, and they start firing them and erasing liberal symbols from the various platforms. That's what we've reached. So to state simply, what is it that liberalism is lacking? It's lacking a focus on the ability to conserve and transmit any set of stable ideas over the course of generations. And so I actually think that this has all happened very quickly, not slowly. That if it's only 2 generations between the time that liberals say, look, our goal is liberty and equality, and everybody thinks that's basically a good idea, until the point where it turns out that there is no definition of liberty and equality that can be maintained as something stable and passed on to the next generation. So it took 2 generations to do that. That's not a success in historic terms.
Okay, I want to jump in if I may, and
Please.
just sort of declare that I'm a skeptic about your use of the term woke neo-Marxists. I think what you're referring to is actually kind of a series of overlapping academic currents that include postmodernism, postcolonialism, cultural studies, multiculturalism, which ironically very often foreground the principle of difference. Sort of the identity-based difference, which in some way echoes your own preference for a difference-based tradition. There are hierarchies in your notion of tradition as well. Liberalism, it seems to me, stands as somewhat of an outlier from these two. Your view and that sort of mix of ideologies that you call woke neo-Marxism. So I'm just struck by that irony. I think, and maybe it can help us foreground what it is that you really want to get at. Is it, as I understand, sort of a conservative vision which allows for, I would say, an equally murky term to that of equality or liberty, namely tradition, to anchor our sense of collective identity? And if so, how do you bring your historical empiricism, which you herald in the book as a kind of preferred alternative to Enlightenment-based reason, how do you marshal your historical empiricism to help us define a difference-based tradition as you would like to see it?
Well, look,
a bunch of questions, but you can.
It's a bunch of questions again.
Yeah.
So look, there are definitely when we're talking about professors. You're right that if we get into the details of what kind of currents are there in academia, I can definitely agree with your description. And I mean, Enlightenment liberalism is a simple term which I think is useful for the assumptions of a certain big group of people in the public sphere, and the same with woke neo-Marxism. But if we get into academic thought, it's obviously much more subtle and has many different small groups. This is particularly clear if you look at liberal political theory. After the 1980s. Certainly by the 1990s, liberal political theory explicitly blows up a lot of the Enlightenment suppositions of liberalism, and it starts moving. In the way that you're describing, it starts moving in the direction of recognizing the existence of groups, recognizing the relationship between group traditions and the autonomy of individuals, which is what liberals are looking for. And you're right that in the sort of progressive liberal academic sphere, for 30 years there's been a movement towards embracing more and more of what looks like conservatism, at least as far as recognizing the existence of traditions and identities. I'm not sure that academics have succeeded in selling that idea to liberals or to anyone else in the public sphere, but you're absolutely right that there is such a sophisticated development in academic political theory. In the new book, what I try to do is to describe the assumptions, the foundations of a conservative society, which is a society in which conservation and transmission are at the center of what the society does. This is a minimum requirement for anything to be able to be transmitted over generations. And I won't go into there's a number of different concepts that I think are crucial, but one of them, for example, is the concept of honor. In the sense of kabed et avicha ve'et imecha, in the sense of honor your father and your mother, which is it's not the same as respect. It means giving weightiness to people who are older than you, your parents, your grandparents, your teachers, the elders of your community, rabbis, but anybody. It could, I mean, government officials, police, whatever it is. And this idea of honor directly tracks the capacity of the society to transmit things, because where young people are taught to honor their parents and their elders, they're also capable of learning from them. That doesn't mean, obviously, that they always agree with them, but they are capable of learning. And so one of the central things that happens in liberal society is that when young people are raised to think that they don't owe anybody honor, that they their job is to think for themselves. And that's a noble aspiration. There's a lot of good that comes of that. But thinking for yourself, when it's to the exclusion of honoring the past, which is the way most of us are raised at this point, means that that the possibility of transmitting anything, a constitutional order, political order, religious order, it becomes impossible.
Yoram, is there anyone in contemporary politics that you think is the standard bearer of these ideas? Someone, who comes from the ground, right? A practitioner, not just an intellectual.
That's a difficult question, because I'm doing two different things. I write my books and essays based on them, and those books reflect my own opinions and not anybody else's. Maybe some of my close collaborators, and at the same time, I'm involved with this public movement that's called national conservatism, and national conservatism is it's an alliance of groups, and that movement has a statement of principles. If you look at the 80 or 90 signatories on it, you'll see that it's a very wide selection of people, and they don't necessarily agree with my political theory in its details or my historiography. So if we want to talk about public figures, then I would say that national conservatism, of which my books are examples, but they're not like the Bible or something of this movement. National conservatism is a rebellion against liberal internationalism. You can almost say it's kind of like a mirror image. That those groups in different countries in the West that have felt that the aim of liberal internationalists of creating a single world order under a single legal system, those who feel that this has gone wrong and that a better world would be a world of independent nations, or a league of independent nations of some kind that would cooperate but would maintain their independence. So it's easy to point to figures who represent that. Okay, so there's lots of them, and some of them you can like, and some of them I like more and some less. But it's not my job to pick political candidates. But obviously, Boris Johnson and the Brexit movement, Donald Trump and his would-be successors, including DeSantis and others, Orban in Hungary, Meloni in Italy. Israel has always had figures like this, and it's pretty easy to include Netanyahu as one of them. But I don't think that you have to be a Likudnik. You could have people in other parts of the spectrum who would also be national conservatives in various ways.
So you don't need to be a woke neo-Marxist to get frightened at that list of leaders that you've just mentioned, or sites.
Right, absolutely not.
Where the suppression of rights, sort of the eradication of protections for minorities as well as individuals, in some instances, particularly Orban's Hungary, have become commonplace. And I mean, part of what's interesting about your book, Yoram, is the autobiographical dimension. You sort of see this as a call not just for a revival of conservative thought, but of a conservative way of life. And there's a kind of idealized utopian quality to it. And it's just hard for me to square that vision, which is quite moving, I must say, and you sort of the genealogy of your own evolution into a conservative thinker with Orban's Hungary, which is far from any ideal of democracy that I could embrace. So I wonder how you square sort of your own evolution into a conservative thinker and your own vision of a kind of conservative utopia, a tradition-based conservative utopia, with the kind of ugly realities of the Orbans and Hungarys of today.
Well, I'm not a utopian, and I write that over and over again. That the purpose of this book is of both of those books, and in general of everything that that I've been working on for decades, is to try to ground political theory in empiricism and realism, in a reality of what is actually possible. And look, I'm not exactly the usual realist, because I do believe in that there are aims and goals and ideals that we should be trying to pursue. But I'm not a utopian because I've had too much experience of real world politics, and I think that our ability to actually get very far in trying to get the world to look like we want it to is in general minimal. You and I are not going to agree about what's going on in Hungary, because I've spent too much time in Hungary and I've talked to too many people, and I don't I just don't buy the story that people are telling about it. I have dozens of friends there who are associated with the circles who are who you say are taking away everybody's rights, and what I see in Hungary is a conservative democracy. It's not a utopia. It's never going to be a utopia, but it continues to uphold free speech and free elections, and it protects its minorities, and the people who surround the prime minister are people who, I think, if you knew them, you would certainly enjoy speaking to them, and you would find that you have a great deal in common. Look, you are a man of the left, and it's not surprising that the right troubles you, just the way that the left troubles me. But I do think that we do agree on the value of a multi-party democratic system, I think. And we do understand that there are threats to that kind of politics, both from the left and from the right. We would evaluate them differently, but we both see that the threats are very, very real. And I try to get this message across in front of every audience that I speak to, that democracy is only possible when there is a mutual recognition of legitimacy between at least two major political parties that would rather grant each other legitimacy than go to war, and that's being rapidly lost. To take the United States as an obvious example, the last two presidential elections have been contested to the extent that I don't know what the numbers are, 30, 40, 50% of the American public thought that both the 2016 and the 2020 elections were rigged or stolen. That's a condition that it's on its way to civil war. And the only way out of it is to try to build a bridge between people like you and people like me. Not that we would be in the same political party, but that we would try to come up with the common grounds for a legitimate continuation of democratic rule and peaceful elections with agreed upon outcomes.
Right. I want to put that to the test by suggesting the following scenario. First of all, I think of you as using the terminology of the Israeli philosopher of Kiva, Ernst Simon, as a Protestant Jew. That is to say, you deeply get the Hebrew Bible, you understand the impulse of sola scriptura, you have a lot of interest in early modern Protestants, and you have a lot of admiration for a Protestant vision of America. And if I understand you correctly, you'd be okay, as part of your national a conservative vision and as part of your reverence for tradition, with a Christian America in which public spaces are filled with the Old and New Testament, in which there'd be public Christ-inspired prayer, crucifixes in classrooms, and things like that. Are you, and if so, where are the Jews in that story? How are Jews supposed to fend for themselves and sort of the right to express themselves in that public square?
I don't think I'm a Protestant Jew. I think that if you come check out my family life and my synagogue, and you're welcome to come for Shabbat.
No, I understand. I understand personal. I understand in your personal.
You'll be
yes, you'll be a Catholic
that,
Jew, but I'm talking about in your political theology and ideology.
I think you'll be satisfied that I'm a perfectly good rabbinic Jew, and the Protestants and the Catholics, they also have, as do the Orthodox, they also have an internal debate. We won't go into that now, but they have an internal debate about the place of Scripture and its standing. We'll save that for another conversation. But you're asking me about what would I be comfortable with? No, look, I'm not comfortable with crucifixes, and that's nothing against Catholicism. I was raised Jewish. I continue to be Jewish, and there are many things about Christianity that are not comfortable for me. I don't, my worldview is the differences between my worldview and those of my Christian friends are many and deep. But here's what I do think. I think that if a Jew or any other person, with any kind of concern for the maintenance of some kind of traditional values, if a Jew or some other such person looks at what's coming, at what is being imposed by the woke. You don't like that term, so we'll say what's being imposed by the more extreme left, which is surprisingly influential, not just on leftist parties, but on conservative parties as well. If there are many people who look at what's coming and they ask themselves, what force can stop it? What could stop it? And my answer to that is clear. Judaism is not going to stop it. There's 2% Jews in America. So it doesn't matter how unified we are and how much we agree, which we don't. Judaism is not going to stop this. So in the United States, what is going to be powerful enough to stop it, if anything, is going to be some kind of revived public Christianity. In most places, that's going to have to be something that is negotiated locally, at the state level, between Protestants and Catholics. And in my experience so far, and I don't want to be naive about this, we're very early on in this discussion, but at this point in the discussion, both the Protestants and the Catholics are happy to bring in Jews and other religious minorities, Muslims, Hindus, into a discussion of what would a public Christianity, or at least a pro-Christian public sphere, look like. And that's something that I personally don't believe it's possible or desirable to impose it from the Supreme Court. It's something that has to be democratically negotiated within those regions in America and in other countries where it's possible to get a majority to support it. Am I comfortable with that? I can come up with a utopian theory of something I'd be more comfortable with, but realistically, I think that's what's going to be proposed as the alternative to the leftist vision.
Joram, as a good rabbinical Jew, I would like to ask you, why did you choose to root the whole philosophical trajectory of the book so much in the Anglo-American tradition rather than the Jewish one? Was it even a dilemma at any point?
It's a book that's if you're asking me about, as a Jew and Israeli, I can say a couple of things. Let's start with, if America goes down, and it's likely to take the entire democratic world with it, and that includes Israel. And so since I do know something about about the Anglo-American tradition, and because America is key, and it turns out to need some help on the subject, I thought it would be good citizenship as a member of the Western democratic nations to express my opinions on that subject and not only on Judaism. The other thing I would add is that in Israel, the lack of knowledge about conservative Anglo-American tradition puts us at a great disadvantage, because what it means is that when young Israelis go to university and they talk about these kind of things, they only hear Marxist views and liberal views. Almost everybody knows, about Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau and Kant, if they've been educated in Israeli universities, but nobody knows about Fortescue and Selden and Hale and Blackstone and Burke and the conservative tradition, or the conservative Federalist Party and the founding of the American Constitution through a restoration of English common law. Israelis don't know these things, and what it means is that Israel is constantly without a real conservative option intellectually, and so. I feel good about helping revive this in other democratic countries, and hopefully it will have some kind of expression in Israel as well. As far as my views on Judaism and the Jewish tradition, I have written a couple of books and essays, and if God gives me, long life and strength, then you can count on me to return to the Jewish tradition and to weigh in on those subjects.
Okay. Yoram Chazoni, thank you very much for joining us today.
Sure, my pleasure. Anytime.
And many thanks to you as well, David.
Great to be with you. Nice to see you, Yoram.
And also thanks to Itai Shelem, the manager of TLV1 Studios. And now we've got a request, because many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has more than 800 interviews to keep you entertained, interested, and hopefully annoyed. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and most important, join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from me here in Tel Aviv, goodbye.